Welcome to the Spiritist Companion podcast. My name is Yuri Castro, and I'll be your companion on this journey where we study, reflect, and put Spiritist teachings into practice. If you enjoyed what you hear, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, to follow our pages, and to send this podcast to someone else as well. Today's topic, my dear friends, touches something very deep, I think, and at the same time shows up in the most ordinary moment of the day. Free will. Are we truly free? If God knows everything, are our choices already decided in advance? And what does any of this have to do with the difficulties we encounter along the way? I believe these are questions that may have stayed with us for a while, so today I wanted to talk through them and see what Spiritism has to say. Firstly, let's go to the Spirits book, published all the way back in 1857, and in question 843, Allan Kardec, who is the codifier of Spiritism, he's going to ask, do humans act with free will? And the spirits are very direct. They're going to say, since they have freedom of thought, they have freedom of action. Without free will, human beings would be machines. And interestingly, I think question 847 is going to touch on a point that we often ask ourselves. Kardec is going to ask, can a distortion of the faculties deprive humans of their free will? Meaning, is there a limit that can happen or can occur if we are misusing those faculties? And the spirits are going to say, those whose intelligence is impaired by any cause are no longer in complete control of their thought, and thereafter they have no more freedom. Such distortion is frequently a punishment for the spirit who might have been vain and proud and might have made bad use of its faculties in another existence. Of course, my dear friends, that the spirits here are alluding to the concept of divine justice, as we talked about over and over in this podcast. So there are ways in which this free will is somewhat restricted, and that's because we often misuse what we have. So therefore, as a learning opportunity or as a learning period, we will have that free will somewhat limited. But going back to the first question, without free will, man would be a machine. God could have created beings that never erred, that followed good automatically, without detours, without stumbling. That's not us. A creation that was perfect in the sense of being efficient. But a creation that never chose would also be a creation that never truly loved, because love that has no other option isn't love, it's programming. And we know we are made for love, out of love, and to reach the highest level of love. The freedom to err is the price of the possibility of loving freely. And Spiritism teaches that God considered that price worth paying. At least that's what we understand. But freedom obviously doesn't exist in a vacuum. It comes paired with something, consequence. Every choice plants a seed, not necessarily immediately. Sometimes the fruit takes a long time. Sometimes it comes in another existence, as the second question that I brought here from the Spirits book. But the law of cause and effect is as real as the law of gravity. And here's a shift in perspective that I find powerful. When we understand that our own choices participate or influence in building the reality we live, the future stops being something fixed that happens to us. It becomes something we are continuously constructing ourselves. That can feel heavy at first because it implies responsibility, but it's also deeply liberating, I think. It means that nothing is permanently lost, that new choices can open paths that earlier choices closed. And if God knows everything, are we still free? That's something that people may ask. And I think it's one of the questions that come up very often when the topic is free will. And it's a good question, of course, no easy answer. Spiritism doesn't resolve the complete logical paradox, but it offers a perspective that I find honest. The fact that God knows the possibilities of our journey doesn't mean He determined each of our choices. An experienced parent, for instance, may know that their child is going to make a particular mistake without that meaning they forced the mistake. What Spiritism makes clear is that the choice is real, that it carries weight, and that it produces effects, and that God respects that freedom. My dear friends, there's another point that I think it's important not to romanticize per se. We don't choose in a vacuum. We are deeply influenced by the upbringing we received, by the family we grew up in, the culture that shaped us, the experiences we've accumulated. And Spiritism adds something here. We're also influenced by the spiritual world, which inspires, suggests, accompanies us. All of that has weight, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the Spirit's book is clear. The final decision remains with us. Influences arrive from every direction, but who decides what to do with them is us. And that distinction between being influenced and being determined is where free will lives. More on that on a future episode of the podcast about the spiritual influence. And if we go back to our dear Master Jesus, we're going to see the free will there as well, because we go to the Gospels and we will see that Jesus never forced anyone ever. When He said, "Follow me," that's an invitation, not a command. Or when He said, "If you wish to be perfect," that's a conditional, that's not an imperative. When He said, "Go and live," that's an opening. In every encounter, our dear Master left the person free to say no, and as we know, some did. The rich young man, for instance, walked away sad because he wasn't ready, and Jesus let him go. I believe that can reveal something about divine law itself. The love God wants from us is a love that only means something if it's chosen. A love born from fear or obligation is not what He's after. Allan Kardec is going to touch on another point here, chapter 9 of the Gospel according to Spiritism, about true freedom. And that's the freedom to govern how we feel. We tend to think of freedom as the absence of restriction, of being able to do anything, to go anywhere, respond as we see fit. But someone who follows every impulse without a filter is not free. They're a prisoner of their own impulses. The meekness Jesus praises in the Beatitudes, for instance, is far from passivity, is the capacity to feel anger, frustration, wounded pride, yes, and to choose not to be governed by them. And that takes way more effort than simply reacting. It's also a much greater kind of freedom. So where does free will actually shows up? Let's look at some examples here. When we're faced with a provocation, someone says something that stings, there's a second, and sometimes even less than that, between receiving and responding. What we do in that space is free will. We can escalate the conflict, or we can stay quiet, or choose a response that doesn't add fuel. Each of those choices strengthens a different habit in the spirit. Also at work, a situation comes up where we could take advantage of something or someone and no one would notice, or where honesty is going to cost us something. The choice we make when no one is watching may be one of the most revealing one of all, of what we do with our free will. Also at home, every conversation with someone we love is a series of small choices. The tone we use, how much we listen before we speak, what we decide to let go, and what we decide to address. Love is also built or worn down in those small choices. Lastly, when we're faced with difficulties, because that's something that we can all relate to. Not everything that happens in life was chosen. Some things arrive without asking permission. But how we respond to those things is where I think free will shows up most clearly. Spiritism also says that God inspires, supports, and illuminates, and never forces us. He gave freedom and respects what He gave too. That means when we go down a wrong path, God doesn't intervene forcefully to redirect us. He may send signs, inspire thoughts, place people in our way to help us, and respects the choice. When we go down a good path, it's because we chose to, and therefore we have the merit of that. And according to Spiritism, that has immense value. So every act of goodness has value precisely because it didn't necessarily have to happen. Every choice toward good is a real achievement. At its core, all inner reform, all inner transformation is this: a sequence of choices repeated until they become habits, and habits repeated until they become character. My dear friends, nobody becomes patient overnight. I would love for that. That would be so easy. That would be so great. But as someone who chooses on a hard day to hold back the impulsive response and then chooses again the next day and again the week after, well, that person concretely becomes more patient. And that's how the spirit evolves, in accumulated choices. And I think the beauty of that is that no good choice is ever wasted. Even when we slide back, even when we fall, we can learn and we can make better choices using our free will. Free will, therefore, is what happens when we decide how we're going to respond to the next difficult situation, the next difficult email that comes in. When we choose the tone we use in a conversation that's heating up. When we decide what to do with 10 free minutes that we have of our time. It's in those moments that freedom is exercised and that the spirit gradually becomes who it will be. We build our own destiny, choice by choice, day by day, which is something I'm always saying in this podcast here. So let's build better habits. Let's use our free will to choose love, to choose good, always. My dear friends, thank you so much for being with me on episode 62 of the Spiritist Companion podcast. I hope this was useful, even if just a little bit, and if it was, please share it with someone else. I'll see you next Monday for another episode of the Spiritist Companion podcast, and until then, please walk under the light of the gospel. With fraternal love, your Spiritist Companion.